On the 7th of September 1764, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth elected a new king, former politician Stanisław Poniatowski. Stanisław was a reform-minded politician at a time when Poland needed it most. He had even once participated in a plot to overthrow the previous king, Archconservative August III, and among his first acts as king was to convene the Sejm in order to abolish the Council of Four Lands, the parallel legislature which had governed Poland's Jews for the previous 200 years. This wasn't as controversial as you might think. The council by this point had become so corrupt and dysfunctional that it was no longer able to meet annually, meaning that it could no longer collect taxes for the crown, the thing it was originally created to do. Additionally, most of Poland's Jews didn't have positive feelings about the council. Over in Hamburg, Jakob Emden had spent decades arguing that Jewish autonomy had been a bad thing, because that kind of legal segregation had pitted religious communities against each other when they really had a lot to learn from each other. If anything, the dissolution of the council hadn't gone far enough, since the provincial Jewish courts known as Kahals still remained in place. And ultimately, it was a drop in the bucket compared to Poland's other problems. For example, the Liberum veto. The Liberum veto was an extreme form of what we might today call the Senate filibuster. Any legislation could be automatically killed if a single member of the Sejm invoked the veto. And they could also shut down the Sejm and void the entire session retroactively. Because of this, by 1764, Poland hadn't passed a single piece of legislation in 30 years, and no meaningful political reforms in over a century. At the same time he abolished the Jewish Council, King Stanisław tried to reform the Liberum veto. But by this time, his predecessor August III had allowed Russia to establish military bases within the Commonwealth in order to avoid forcing Poland into the 7 Years' War. Although the war was over, the Russians had since used their presence to buy off reformist politicians in the Sejm. So while Stanisław was favored by the Russians, the reforms inevitably failed, and even though political parties had been banned since 1717, most of Polish society thus became divided between the pro-Russian but pro-reform Radom Confederation and the pro-independence but very fundamentalist Catholic Bar Confederation. Poland's Jews didn't have a natural ally on either side and mostly tried to remain neutral, but it was no use. In 1768, the Bar Confederation revolted against Russian domination. And while they imposed disproportionate taxes on non-Catholics, Radomites in the eastern frontiers suspected anyone who wasn't Eastern Orthodox of being Bar sympathizers, leading to the infamous massacre of Uman, in which over 2,000 Jewish, Polish, and Ukrainian Catholic civilians were murdered by pro-Russian Cossacks. Ultimately, nobody in Poland got what they wanted. The country remained under Russian domination, the reforms of 1764 were quietly abandoned, and Russia, Austria, and Prussia used the revolt as an excuse to partition large areas of the Commonwealth between themselves. Poland's days were numbered. In many ways, the dysfunction that had existed within the Jewish legal system in Poland for the previous century was just an extension of the dysfunction at the heart of Poland's government. And despite the elimination of the council, it was only getting worse. With the crisis of Frankism now dealt with, Jewish politics in the Commonwealth refocused on the long-simmering rivalry between the Hasidic movement and their more established rabbinic opponents, or Mitnagdim. Born in 1720 to a wealthy family of Lithuanian rabbis, Eliyahu Kremer was gifted with a photographic memory and what seems to me like a severe case of attention deficit disorder. Whatever the case, he was a child prodigy who skipped elementary school and had completed his rabbinic education without an instructor at the age of 7. An experience which endowed him with a deep disdain for formal education, and particularly the poor quality of education in Jewish schools at the time. Essentially, children, boys at least, were being educated exclusively in Jewish law for the sole purpose of using Jewish law. But Kremer believed that the purpose of education was to be educated. So instead, he applied an academic, almost scientific approach to the entire body of Jewish law, language, and history, as well as secular subjects like math and astronomy. By the age of 20, he had moved to the capital, Vilnius, where rabbis decades his senior were seeking him for advice, and he was freely re-editing major texts like the Talmud due to perceived linguistic and logical errors. The saying went that he was the greatest mind in Judaism since the era of the Gaonim 1,000 years earlier, hence his nickname, the Vilna Gaon. Yet despite his renown, or perhaps because of it, the Gaon declined to serve as a judge or officer of the Jewish courts, and never taught at a yeshiva. None of his writings were published while he was still alive, and in fact he refused to self-identify by the title of rabbi. Even after inheriting his father's wealth in the 1750s, the Gaon continued to live a reclusive life locked away in his study, suffering from severe sleep deprivation and rarely ever speaking even to his own children. Whereas Jewish men traditionally only wore tefillin while praying 3 times a day, the Gaon wore them all day during his studies. To wear the tefillin without defiling them required focusing entirely on thoughts of God, so to wear them all day was both a serious power move and a little worrying. It's precisely this habit of getting lost in his own head that made him a notorious absentee father. Now, you might get the impression that the Gaon would fit in quite well with the rising tide of Hasidism, but in fact, he was perhaps the most outspoken of the Mitnagdim. He loathed the Hasidic practice of pilpul. He felt that the Hasidim were dividing Judaism by establishing different standards for things like times of prayer and methods of kosher slaughter, and at times he even suspected the movement of being Sabbatean in nature. Now, the Gaon wasn't a hardline reactionary of the sort that, say, Moshe Chagiz had been. He had a great love of the Kabbalah, but he maintained that careful study and intellectual curiosity was the tried and tested path to spiritual fulfillment. And as it so happens, Hasidism would finally present the Gaon with his match. Under the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidism had been a fairly nebulous movement concentrated in the poorest part of the Commonwealth, but this began to change with the Baal Shem's death in 1760, as leadership of the movement was subsequently consolidated by his disciple Dovber ben Avraham, better known as the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid redirected the Baal Shem Tov's populism, instead privileging the Hasidic Rebbe as a direct link between ordinary people and God, totally removed from all worldly concerns and to which his followers should be totally obedient. This helped to establish the concept of Hasidic dynasties, not only of teachers and students, but actual hereditary followings passed from father to son. The Vilna Gaon was especially alarmed by this practice. Now, you might expect these changes to turn people off Hasidism, and indeed, the majority of Hasidic dynasties after this point ended up becoming much more insular. But the Maggid's youngest student, Shneor Zalman, turned away from his master's asceticism. In his teachings, later published in the Tanya, Shneor Zalman extolled the virtues of finding divinity in the physical world through charity and study that empowered the religious journey of the individual. He rejected what he saw as the incuriosity of Hasidism up to that point, instead outlining a path to union with the divine through wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, or in Hebrew, Chabad. So it may not surprise you to hear that, before joining Hasidism, Shneor Zalman had been a great admirer of the Vilna Gaon. He was from Lithuania, and his classmates had once dismissed him for being too Lithuanian and overly receptive to criticism from the Mitnagdim. In short, he was the one Hasidic leader that the Gaon might actually listen to. But he didn't. In 1774, Shneor Zalman traveled to Vilnius to plead his case to the Gaon concerning a cherem that had recently been issued by the rabbinate of Brody against the entire Hasidic movement. The Gaon refused to even see him. Many years later, when Shneor Zalman became the de facto Hasidic leader of Lithuania, the Gaon influenced the Vilnius rabbinate to issue their own cherem against him. But there was something else that the two men weirdly had in common. Although there was a full generation between them, both men in their youths had attempted to emigrate to the Holy Land. Their exact motivations are kinda hard to explain, as are the reasons they didn't go through with it, but there was also an external factor. As it turns out, the mid to late 18th century was a uniquely good time for Jews in diaspora to make Aliyah. Back when Suleiman the Magnificent conquered the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517, he had allocated huge sums of money and thousands of Jewish refugees from Spain to rebuild and revitalize the region. And that was it. In the 2 centuries since, Damascus and Sidon Eyalets had fallen into complete dereliction. But this created both an opportunity and a demand for change, especially in the once prosperous agricultural region of the Galilee. In the late 1720s, a local tax collector named Dar Omar al-Zaidani seized control of Tiberias and the surrounding countryside and basically convinced the governor of Sidon Ayalit to let him do so on the basis that it wouldn't interfere with taxation. From there, Omar and his family began forcing out local tribal leaders in the mountains and plains, allowing him to harness the local cotton and olive industries and use the profits to pay off many of the outstanding debts held by local merchants, winning the loyalty of both the merchants and their creditors. This was key in allowing Omar to seize Acre by July 1746, leaving him in control of the entire Galilee. Although already in his 50s, Omar's ambitions were just beginning. For the next decade, he threw his extensive resources into rebuilding the Galilee basically from scratch. Other than Safed, which was more or less destroyed during a Druze revolt in 1759, every 18th century building in northern Israel today was built by Omar, and many older buildings survive only through his restoration efforts. He rebuilt marketplaces and administrative buildings, expanded small farming hamlets into market towns, and rebuilt the walls of Acre in the European style with the latest artillery. But this was nothing compared to his most lasting achievement. Beginning in 1757, Omar crossed into Damascus Ayalit, took control of Mount Carmel, and fortified it to fend off the ongoing scourge of piracy. He then demolished a small farming village at the bottom of the mountain called Haifa, and rebuilt it 2 kilometers further east as a proper deep water port that could accommodate much larger ships than Acre. This changed everything, because not only had Dar Omar transformed the Galilee into a desirable place to live, he had also just made it a lot easier to get to. Offset by increased revenues from shipping, Omar lowered taxes on Jews and helped fund the construction of new Jewish schools and synagogues. By these means, Omar actively sought to bring Jewish immigrants into his domain, and Aliyah, the return of Jews to the land of Israel, went from an aspirational dream undertaken only by a few rabbis and their families to a normalized, realistic option for ordinary Jews in Europe and North Africa. Omar applied the same immigration and taxation policy to Christians, and whatever outcry these moves may have provoked was mitigated by the popular enthusiasm for his military achievements. In 1771, Omar expanded his territory even further. However, he had only been able to do this because the Ottoman Empire had been distracted by a war with Russia. With the end of that war in 1774, the Ottomans turned against him, followed quickly by his local allies and eventually his own officers, who shot him in the back and sent his severed head to the new sultan. Although Dar Omar's political legacy ended in defeat, he had left the Galilee more powerful and prosperous, a beacon to new immigrants of all the Abrahamic faiths, including a large number of Jews. Had Shneor Zalman succeeded in making the move, he would hardly have been the first Hasidic Rebbe to do so. Some decades later, many students of the Gaon would resettle there, becoming an integral part of the old Yishuv. The Gaon himself would not live to go with them. He would, however, live to see the end of an independent Poland. Inspired by the newly independent United States, King Stanisław brought together what remained of the Polish government in 1788 to establish an American-style constitution, which among other things expanded voting rights, created 3 branches of government headed by a bicameral legislature, and reformed the monarchy into a figurehead role. All of these reforms were designed to remove the mechanisms by which foreign powers had been able to interfere in Poland's internal politics. But it was too late. Poland alone no longer had the capacity to defend itself in the event that Russia took the new constitution as a threat, which of course it did. By this time, the French Revolution had been going on for 2 years and was rapidly escalating, which the Russian Empress Yekaterina the Great and her ministers used as an excuse to stamp out the threat of Jacobinism by invading Poland. Poland had entered into a defensive alliance with Prussia, but feeling that the alliance was too one-sided and reeling from a series of defeats by revolutionary France, Prussia refused to intervene, instead working with Russia to partition Poland a second time in 1793. Under the Treaty of Grodno, what little remained of Poland was effectively placed under permanent Russian occupation. The Polish army was all but dissolved, with a token force of 15,000 troops remaining, while virtually all of the experienced general staff and officer corps were forced into early retirement. This is a strategy employed by occupying military powers throughout the centuries, and it's worked exactly never. Within 6 months of the new partition, a whole bunch of generals and politicians had joined forces in exile and sent Lieutenant General Tadeusz Kościuszko to seize power in Krakow, and the whole thing started over again. Within days, other former officers had seized control in Warsaw and Vilnius, and by late April, Russian troops had withdrawn from Poland completely. But that wasn't going to last. Now Prussia and Austria were getting involved, and while Kościuszko proved surprisingly capable of halting their advance, his mix of light infantry and untrained peasants clearly wasn't cutting it. Enter Berek Yoselowicz, a Jewish horse trader whose work in France had turned him into a fierce revolutionary. Dating back to the Middle Ages, Jews, like many ethnic minorities in Poland, had traditionally gravitated towards the light cavalry. So in April 1794, Yoselowicz and his associate Józef Aronowicz put out a call to arms that was happily answered by 500 volunteers. On the 17th of September 1794, Yoselowicz was appointed colonel of the new Orthodox Light Horse Regiment. Yoselowicz's appointment was the source of great controversy, and not just because of his lack of military experience. Even during the Polish Golden Age, officers had been commissioned based on noble rank, which made Yoselowicz both the first Jewish officer in the Commonwealth Army and the last. Many superiors scorned his lack of funds with which to outfit his soldiers. He had already lent his life savings to the rebellion, and recruited his men with 3,000 zlotys worth of stamps. But many other officers, similarly inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, embraced Yoselowicz. The Orthodox Light Horse Regiment was not just a military unit with Jews. It was a Jewish unit, whose men conducted themselves fully in the tradition, from keeping kosher to avoiding drills on Saturdays to growing out beards, from which they received their nickname, the Beardlings. This wasn't just a proclamation of Jewish pride. It was a demonstration that Judaism was fully compatible with the rights of man. Almost all of the Beardlings were wiped out at Praga, the final battle of the rebellion, after which the Russian army massacred thousands of civilians. Berek Yoselowicz was among the few survivors, and when news arrived that the rebel leaders had conceded defeat, he was released and fled into Austrian-controlled Galicia. A year later, Prussia, Russia, and Austria agreed to partition Poland once and for all. The official dissolution of the Polish state went into effect in January 1797. The Vilna Gaon died 9 months later. However, this was not entirely the end of Jewish rights in what had once been Poland. Russia was still very much a feudal state, and because of the complicated legal situations that often arise from that system, the Statute of Kalisz, which had first guaranteed Jewish rights in Poland, continued to uphold Jewish rights in all of the territory that Russia had annexed from the Commonwealth, with similar provisions from the territories they had recently conquered from the Ottoman Empire. And only those areas, as Russia already held a policy banning Jews, and as far as their core territory was concerned, that wasn't about to change. As a compromise between Baltic merchants who welcomed the Jews as trading partners and the Russian Orthodox Church who demanded their expulsion. Accordingly, Yekaterina prohibited Jews from obtaining Russian citizenship or continuing to live in mixed neighborhoods, and raised the Jewish tax rate to quadruple that imposed on ethnic Russians. This territory came to be known as Cherta Osedlosti, or the Pale of Settlement, and within a generation, the Jews living there had developed a reputation for poverty, backwardness, and persecution. But Prussia and Austria were a different story altogether. In those countries, and increasingly across the rest of Europe, the disciples of the late Jakob Emden were already brushing aside the old ideas of Jewish autonomy in favor of a radical new definition of Jewish liberty: emancipation. Special thanks to my patrons, including Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, and Sergei Gerasimov.